Hey everybody, today we're going to be tackling another aspect of the genealogy of Christ that we find in Matthew 1 through 17 that we didn't talk about in the sermon from this past Sunday. So if you have looked at the sermon, the main points that you find from verse 17 are throughout the entire genealogy. And we hit those main points, but because of how complicated verse 17 can be, I decided not to use it for the sermon itself, but instead making a separate video for it. So if you look at verse 17 from Matthew 1, it says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David until the exile to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the exile to Babylon until Christ, 14 generations, period." And it's like, okay, what's the point of that? Here's what makes it even more complicated. That's not true. If you look at First Kings, if you look at Chronicles, we see that there are not that exact amount of generations. If you look at the middle section is the one we had the most documentation for. All of those kings, there's actually some kings missing. There's more than 14 generations there. Most scholars believe that that's true, at least for the period before that, if not the period after that as well. So why would Matthew make such a point to say there's 14 generations when there's not 14 generations? Is he lying to us? Well, no. And why would he? That'd be a really silly lie. Was he uninformed? Was he taught something wrong? No, he had access to the scriptures that they had. They knew their genealogies. Genealogies were very important. They knew their genealogies. He was not. He didn't make that mistake. He wasn't taught that wrong. He knew what he was talking about. If you look through the rest of Matthew, it's very obvious that the writer of Matthew, who was Matthew, knew enough about the Old Testament, knew enough about Jewish history that he wouldn't have made this huge error. So why in the world did he make such a major point here in verse 17 out of the fact there's these 14 generations when there's not? And what it comes down to is this thing called gematria. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but gematria, especially at the time in Jewish culture, was very important. It was used all the time, and the people who were reading this, it would have been second nature to them. So as David uses this as a sub-point to make his point about how Jesus is the next David, he's a descendant of David, and he is king in the right of David and king of the Jews, and in fact, king of the whole world. Well, he's using this number 14 to make that sub-point. That would have been obvious. He wouldn't have had to explain that to the Jews at the time, though now I have to make a separate video in order to explain it. So, in fact, I have to research it myself. As I got to here, I started digging into it, and I just, for a while, I was just confused. I was like, this is kind of a silly point to make, but what it comes down to is this was kind of second nature, using Hebrew in this way as kind of second nature back at that time. Hebrew can be a really fascinating language, and I don't know, I haven't studied English or any of these other languages very well, so I don't know exactly if these concepts aren't in other languages, but I know in Hebrew how they form the words impact their meaning. How the letters that they choose, certain letters have certain meanings, and then they put those letters together in order to make more meanings. It's almost like hieroglyphics plus a regular alphabet at the same time. It's very cool and interesting. But what gematria is, it's a number system, and so that number system, and I have it here on the board, and I had to work really hard at my Hebrew and to do this backwards. So good for me, right? So what we have here is the number 14, and the number 14, I have it broken down into these three numbers, and you'll see why in a second. But the number 14 was the number of the kingdom. It meant kingdom. So when you use the number 14, it would mean kingdom at the time when Matthew is writing. So if he puts in there 14, people are saying, oh, this is the kingdom. This is the king. Okay, Jesus is king. It was an exclamation point at the end of the genealogy to say, yes, Jesus is absolutely king. That's the point of verse 17. It serves as an exclamation mark that Jesus is indeed the descendant of David and the rightful king of Israel. And he does it by using that number 14. He says it 3 times, at 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. He's saying, look, the king is here, and the king is Jesus, and Jesus fulfills this kingdom. So why 14? Okay, so we have 4, 6, and 4. That's added up to be 14. All right. Now we have these letters from Hebrew that represent these numbers. So this is kind of the Hebrew D, all right, and this is kind of the Hebrew W is the 6th letter in the Hebrew D again. And so they have 4, 6, and 4 as the numbers for these letters. Okay, so as you see that, it comes down to D, V, and D. Okay, and at that time, way back in the day, okay, in the Old Testament, they didn't have vowels. So this is how you would spell David. You wouldn't have the vowel in the word itself. And so this is how you would do David. So David, okay, without vowels, in Hebrew, transliterated into Gematria, equals, see if I can do this right, the number 14. Okay, and that is why the number 14 is so predominant in verse 17 of this genealogy, and that is why it serves as the exclamation mark at the end of this passage. This is the last video for my first sermon in the series in Matthew 1 through 17. But next week we're going to be looking at the next section, which is Matthew 1:18 all the way through Matthew 2:12. So I'm looking forward to that.